The letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with wax the color of dried blood. Thomas Whitmore held it in his weathered hands, standing alone in the doorway of his failing grain mill, watching dust motes drift through the broken window. The envelope bore no return address, only his name written in careful script. Inside, a message that would tear apart everything he thought he understood about survival, sacrifice, and what it meant to belong to a place that had never wanted him. He was a man with nothing to offer but his word, a man the town had already decided wasn't worth knowing. And somehow, that was exactly why someone was about to change his life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Whitmore had learned long ago that desperation has a smell. It smells like rust and failure, like the inside of a grain mill that hasn't processed wheat in 6 months. It smells like the mortgage papers stacked on his kitchen table, each one marked with a red stamp that said, "Final Notice." He was 43 years old, thin in the way that comes from skipping meals so your children won't, with hands too calloused to hold anything gently anymore. His property sat 3 miles outside the town of Millbrook, Colorado, close enough to see the church steeple on Sundays, far enough away that no one from town bothered to visit. No one had visited in years. The mill itself was his father's legacy, a structure of timber and iron that had once ground wheat for half the county. Now it stood like a monument to decline, its great wheel frozen mid-rotation, its gears seized by rust and time. Thomas had tried everything. He'd taken loans he couldn't repay. He'd worked other men's land for wages that barely covered his children's shoes. He'd sold off equipment piece by piece until the mill was hollow, a skeleton of what it had been. His daughters Margaret, 16, and Catherine, 14, had stopped asking why they couldn't stay in school like the other children. They'd stopped asking about new dresses. They'd stopped asking about a lot of things. The letter had come from an unexpected source, Chief Running Bear of the Southern Ute Band, who maintained territory in the mountains just beyond Millbrook's reach. Thomas knew of him the way all ranchers and farmers knew of him, as a name that made certain men nervous, as a figure who represented everything the town wanted, pushed further away. Running Bear had no reason to know Thomas Whitmore existed. They'd never met. They moved in worlds that didn't intersect. Yet the letter was unmistakably addressed to him. Thomas read it 3 times before the words began to make sense. "I have seen your daughters at the creek, where my people draw water. I have watched them work without complaint. I have observed their character. I have a proposal that may save your life and theirs. Come to the ridge at sunset tomorrow. Come alone." It was impossible. It was a trick. It was. He didn't finish the thought. Instead, he folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his shirt, against his heart, as if proximity to his body might make it less terrifying. That evening, he sat across from Margaret and Catherine at a table that held only bread and beans. The lamp between them cast long shadows. Margaret was braiding Catherine's hair with the patience of someone who had learned to make small kindnesses out of nothing. They didn't look hungry anymore because they'd learned to exist on the edge of hunger so well it had become normal. "I have business in the hills tomorrow," Thomas said quietly. "I'll be gone until late." Margaret's hands stilled in Catherine's hair. "What kind of business?" "The kind that might change things." She didn't ask more. Girls who grow up poor learn not to ask questions that might reveal how fragile hope is. The ridge stood dark against the sunset, all jagged stone and pine. Thomas had ridden his old horse, the only one he still owned, up the winding trail, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The letter could have been a trap. Men from town had done worse for less reason than to drive out a failing farmer. But as he crested the ridge, he saw that Running Bear had come alone. The Apache Chief sat on horseback, silhouetted against the burning sky. He was older than Thomas had expected, his face carved by decades of sun and hardship, his hair streaked with silver. He wore simple clothes, no war paint, no feathers, nothing theatrical. Just a man on a horse, waiting. "You came," Running Bear said. It wasn't a question. "I came," Thomas replied. "You know who I am? The town talks, but the town talks about a lot of things. Something that might have been respect flickered across Running Bear's face. He gestured for Thomas to ride closer, and they sat in silence for a long moment, two men from incompatible worlds, watching the light drain from the sky. "I have 3 daughters," Running Bear said finally. "The oldest is 18, the others are 16 and 14. They are strong, educated in the ways that matter. One of them will inherit what I have built. But I will not live forever. When I am gone, my people will face pressure from settlers, from government men who want the land. My daughters will need protection that blood cannot provide." Thomas listened, not understanding. A man from the town, your town, would legitimize their claim to remain here, would make them harder to move, harder to dismiss. A man with nothing to lose would be more likely to protect them fiercely. A man who understands desperation would understand what it means to fight for survival. The sun touched the horizon and didn't move, holding the world in that moment between day and night. "You want me to marry one of your daughters," Thomas said. "It wasn't a question. I want you to choose one of them," Running Bear corrected. "And I want you to understand what you're choosing. Not a bride, not a servant, a partner. Someone who will stand beside you while the world burns around you both. The town will never accept it. No," Running Bear agreed. "They will not. That is why I am asking you instead of demanding it." Thomas thought of his daughters, of the bread and beans, of the mortgage papers with their red stamps. He thought of Margaret's patient hands and Catherine's quiet strength. He thought of the mill, standing empty and dying, a monument to a man who couldn't save anything. "If I say no," Thomas asked, "what happens? You lose the mill, your daughters lose their home, you become refugees in a land that has decided you don't belong, but you remain free to choose your own path. And if I say yes, you save your family. You gain a wife with land, resources, knowledge. You gain protection from a man who still has power in these mountains, and you accept that half the world will despise you for it. That will never change." Running Bear turned his horse slightly, and in the last light, Thomas saw his face clearly. There was no malice in it. There was only the exhaustion of a man trying to protect something he loved from a world determined to destroy it. "I give you 3 days to decide," Running Bear said. "Then I send the messenger back with your answer. Your daughters, they know nothing of this. The choice is yours alone to make." He rode away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the darkening pines like he'd never been there at all. Thomas sat on his horse for a long time after, watching the stars emerge in the purple sky, each one a question he couldn't answer. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch of his failing house, listening to the wind move through the empty mill, and tried to imagine a version of his future that didn't end in loss. It was harder than he expected. By morning, he still hadn't decided, but he knew with a certainty that scared him that he would. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second day came with a visitor Thomas hadn't anticipated. Sheriff Caldwell rode up to the mill in the early afternoon, dust settling on his uniform like he'd traveled hard to get there. His presence was a door opening onto rooms Thomas wasn't prepared to enter. "Heard some interesting rumors," the sheriff said, dismounting with the heaviness of a man carrying more weight than his body could hold. "Folks in town saying you've been conducting business with the Ute." "That true?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He was sweeping the porch, an old habit, when nervous, pushing dust that would return tomorrow into piles that meant nothing. The sheriff watched him, waiting. "I had a meeting," Thomas said finally. "That's not illegal." "No, it ain't," Caldwell agreed, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "But it's unusual, and unusual things make people talk, especially when the person they're talking about is already on borrowed time with the bank." There it was. The thing Thomas had known but not wanted to face directly. That his failure wasn't just financial, it was becoming social. It was becoming the kind of story people told as a warning. "What do they say?" Thomas asked, though he didn't really want to know. Caldwell settled against the porch railing, his old leather creaking. He was a decent man, one of the few in Millbrook who'd never actively been cruel. But decency and action were different things. "They say you're desperate enough to do something foolish. They say Running Bear's been watching your girls. They say—" He paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "They say he's offered you something you can't refuse and that you're thinking about taking it." "And what do you think?" Thomas asked. "I think a man in your position has limited choices, and I think the people making you choose them don't care much about your daughter's futures as long as their own world stays comfortable." Caldwell put his hat back on, pulling it low. "I also think if you're considering something like that, you should know what it actually means, not the romantic version, the real version." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. Inside were newspaper clippings, faded and worn. Thomas recognized them immediately. Stories from 5 years ago, when a settler named Robert Henley had married a Cheyenne woman from a neighboring tribe. The union had been peaceful, but the response hadn't been. His house had burned, his cattle had been poisoned. His wife had been attacked in broad daylight while he was working, left with scars that ran from her shoulder to her wrist. Eventually they'd fled to California, abandoning everything. "There's more," Caldwell said quietly, "but you get the picture. The world doesn't forgive that kind of choice easy, and your daughters, they'd live with that consequence every day." After the sheriff left, Thomas walked to the creek, where he'd learned the girls went for water. He didn't go to meet them, just stood in the trees, watching them from a distance. Margaret was teaching Catherine how to filter water through cloth, a practical skill born from necessity. Catherine was laughing, actually laughing at something Margaret had said, her face bright in the afternoon light. They were so young, so fragile, so completely dependent on him to not destroy their lives. He turned away before they could see him. That night, Thomas made a decision. Not the decision Running Bear had asked him to make, but a different one. He would go to the ridge again, but not to accept an offer. He would go to refuse it, but with a question that had been eating at him since the letter arrived. He arrived at dusk, and Running Bear was already there, as if he'd known Thomas would come. The chief sat motionless on his horse, watching the sun descend, waiting. "I can't do this," Thomas said without preamble. "I can't risk my daughter's futures on a choice that will make them pariahs. I won't, not even if it costs me everything." Running Bear nodded slowly, as if this too had been expected. "Then you understand what I told you about my daughters. You understand the weight of choosing someone else's path." "I came to ask you something," Thomas continued. "Why me? There must be other men, younger men, men with something to offer besides desperation." For the first time, Running Bear smiled. It was small, barely visible, but it changed his entire face. "Because most men would have made the same choice you made just now. They would have come to this ridge and said yes, and spent the rest of their lives resenting their wives for the consequences. You came to say no, because you love your daughters more than you love saving yourself." He dismounted slowly and walked toward Thomas. This close, Thomas could see the exhaustion behind his eyes, the weight of being the last thing standing between his people and erasure. "But the offer stands," Running Bear said. "Not to marry, to work. I need someone to manage the territory between my land and the town. Someone who understands both worlds. Someone who can negotiate, who can live in the space where enemies become neighbors. The pay would save your mill. Your daughters would be protected by association with my family. You would owe me nothing but your honest work." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. "Why would you offer this?" "Because I see in you what I see in my daughters, the ability to build bridges instead of walls. And because, Mr. Whitmore, even men with power cannot change the world alone. Sometimes we need each other, even when the world tells us we shouldn't." The third day came with consequences. Thomas went to the bank and met with Mr. Ashford, a man whose face had become synonymous with everything slipping away. Thomas laid out the proposal, not the marriage, but the work arrangement. Regular payment from the Ute Territory for management services, enough to cover the mortgage, enough to keep the mill. Ashford's expression cycled through confusion, suspicion, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "This is legitimate?" he asked. "This isn't some arrangement that will blow up in my face?" "It's legitimate," Thomas confirmed. The banker signed the papers that afternoon. But the real storm came later. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Thomas Whitmore was working for the Ute now. He'd gone over, as the men at the saloon said. He'd betrayed the town's interests for money. The church's ladies' auxiliary stopped greeting Margaret and Catherine at the general store. Men who'd previously ignored Thomas now went out of their way to acknowledge his fall with pointed silence. But something else happened too. The mill began to run again. Thomas hired workers, men who needed employment and didn't care where it came from. He brought the machinery back to life, grain by grain, until the great wheel turned and the sound of production filled the valley again. Margaret took over the accounts, and her careful mathematics proved that the mill could be profitable. Catherine found work in the growing territory between two worlds, learning the languages and customs that made communication possible. Running Bear's daughters came to the mill one morning in late autumn. They arrived without announcement, riding side by side, dressed simply, but with the bearing of people who knew their own worth. The oldest, Sarah, she introduced herself, had her father's quiet strength. The middle daughter, Rachel, had his sharp intelligence. The youngest, Rebecca, had a gentleness that seemed improbable given her upbringing. "Father told us about your visit," Sarah said. "About why you came the second time." Thomas didn't know what to say. He'd expected judgment or pity. Instead, what he saw in their faces was recognition. "He chose well when he chose you," Sarah continued, "not because you would have married one of us, but because you understood that sometimes the bravest choice is to say no when everyone expects you to say yes." They spent the afternoon at the mill, learning how it operated, asking questions about grain processing and equipment maintenance. By evening, they'd become something between customers and advisors, and Thomas found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't in years. When they left, Rebecca turned back at the gate. "My father said you're building something here, not a business, a bridge. He said he doesn't have many of those." She smiled. "He wanted you to know that matters." That night, Thomas sat with Margaret and Catherine on the porch of the mill, watching the stars emerge. The mortgage papers were no longer on the kitchen table. The property taxes were paid through spring. The work was steady and honest. "People in town are still angry," Margaret said carefully. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "Is it worth it?" He looked at his daughters, strong, resilient, alive in ways they hadn't been since their mother died. He thought about the mill turning, grain flowing, purpose returning. He thought about Running Bear's face in the last light of the ridge, a man making impossible choices to protect his world. "Sometimes," Thomas said, "the people who matter most aren't the ones yelling the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones sitting in silence beside you, waiting for you to figure out who you actually are." The autumn wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of coming winter and the first seeds of spring. In the distance, toward the mountains, a lone wolf howled. And Thomas Whitmore, a poor farmer who'd chosen his daughters over his salvation, heard in that sound something that sounded remarkably like forgiveness. The bridge between two worlds had begun to hold. Winter came early that year, arriving with a ferocity that caught most of the valley, unprepared. By December, the passes were already impassable, and the town of Millbrook found itself isolated, cut off from supplies, from news, from the reassurance that the outside world still existed. It was the kind of winter that made men desperate, and desperate men made bad decisions. The first sign of trouble came through Catherine, who'd become the primary liaison between the mill and Running Bear's territory. She arrived at dawn with her hands bleeding from frostbite, her horse near collapse. Thomas pulled her from the saddle before she could explain, wrapping her in blankets while Margaret heated water. "There's sickness," Catherine said through chattering teeth. "Influenza. It came through the settlement 3 weeks ago. Running Bear's people are dying. They need medicines, supplies, someone who knows how to tend the sick." The implications hung in the cold air between them. In winter, when movement between territories was nearly impossible, Running Bear's people were trapped. And in Millbrook, where Running Bear's name had become synonymous with danger and betrayal, no one would volunteer to help. Thomas made the decision before he fully understood what it meant. "We go to them." "You can't," Margaret said immediately. "The passes aren't more impossible than people dying when we have what they need." He spent the rest of that day gathering supplies. Medicine from the doctor in town, the same doctor who'd looked at Thomas with something like pity when he'd explained what he needed it for. Blankets, dried food. Herbs Catherine said the Ute used for fever. By evening, he and Catherine were ready to leave. Margaret stood in the doorway of the mill, her face hard with something between anger and understanding. "If you don't come back, I will," Thomas said. "If you don't, the town will blame you for whatever happens. They'll say you chose them. They'll use it against us. They're already saying that." "Not like this," Margaret warned. "Not when people are dying." But Thomas had already made his peace with that particular loss. The journey took 2 days instead of the usual 4 hours. The passes were treacherous, blocked by snow that came up to the horses' shoulders. Catherine led, following landmarks that only she could see, while Thomas followed, carrying supplies that felt increasingly inadequate as they climbed higher. They found the settlement in chaos, tents and crude shelters covered in snow, smoke rising from fires that provided more comfort than actual warmth. And everywhere, the sound of coughing, deep, rattling, the kind of sound that meant lungs filling with fluid, bodies shutting down. Running Bear met them at the edge of the settlement. He looked older than he had in autumn, as if sickness had siphoned something essential from him. His face when he saw Thomas was complicated gratitude mixed with something that looked like guilt. "You shouldn't have come," Running Bear said. "Where is Sarah?" Thomas asked instead of responding. Running Bear's jaw tightened. "In the healer's tent. She's been caring for the worst cases. She won't stop." Thomas found Sarah exactly where her father said she'd be, in a tent heated by burning rocks, moving between the sick with the deliberate focus of someone running on will alone. She was thin, her face gaunt, her hands cracked and bleeding like Catherine's. When she saw Thomas, she didn't stop what she was doing. "You brought medicine," she said. It wasn't a question. She was already taking inventory of what he'd brought, her mind calculating doses and treatments with the precision of someone who'd been forced to learn medicine through desperation. "We brought what we could gather quickly," Thomas said. "Catherine can show you." "Catherine should rest. She's exhausted." Sarah was binding a child's fever-bright forehead with cloth soaked in cold water. "You, though, you can help. Have you ever nursed the sick?" "No." "Then you'll learn." For the next 5 days, Thomas didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. He learned to recognize the difference between fevers that might break and fevers that meant death was coming. He learned which herbs helped with breathing, which offered comfort when nothing else could. He learned Sarah's particular brand of quiet authority, the way she could command respect without raising her voice, the way she seemed to see not just the disease, but the person suffering from it. He also learned that Rachel, the middle daughter, was dying. Sarah told him on the 3rd night, her voice flat with exhaustion and something deeper, the sound of someone who'd made peace with loss while still fighting against it. Rachel had contracted the illness early, had continued working through the symptoms until her body simply stopped cooperating. Now she lay in the deepest part of the tent, breathing shallow, her body burning even as she shivered. "She's strong," Sarah said, not as comfort, but as fact. But strength only carries you so far. Thomas sat with Rachel through the night. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her father, sometimes speaking in a language Thomas didn't understand. He kept the cloth on her forehead wet. He held water to her lips when she could swallow. He did the small, useless things that were all anyone could do in the face of illness that didn't negotiate or compromise. By morning, Rachel's breathing had become easier, not better, easier, the kind of easy that comes when the body stops fighting and accepts what's coming. Sarah, when she saw it, sat down beside her sister and held her hand without speaking. But Rachel didn't die that day, or the next. Instead, slowly, impossibly, her fever broke. Her breathing deepened. Her eyes, when they opened, were aware and present. It took 3 more days for her to sit up, and another week before she could walk, but she lived. The settlement began to shift around this moment, as if Rachel's survival had rewritten something fundamental about how the sickness moved through the community. Other patients who'd seemed destined to die began to recover. The coughing lessened. The smell of death that had hung over everything began to fade. When the crisis finally passed, Thomas had lost track of how long he'd been there. 2 weeks, maybe 3. His hands were raw. His voice had gone hoarse from quiet instructions. His mind felt hollowed out, capable of only the most basic thoughts. Running Bear found him on the morning Thomas was preparing to leave. The chief looked like himself again, the exhaustion still there, but the core of him solidified, no longer fragmenting under the weight of potential loss. "You saved my daughter's life," Running Bear said. "Sarah saved your daughter's life. I just helped. You helped when you could have stayed home. When your own town is likely already speaking against you for having done so." Thomas didn't argue. They both knew it was true. "There is no debt between us now," Running Bear continued. "The arrangement stands because it is fair trade, not because you owe me. I wanted you to know that." Catherine was waiting when Thomas returned to the mill. She'd ridden back 4 days earlier to tell Margaret what was happening, and the news had spread through Millbrook like oil spreading across water. The town was divided. Some people saw Thomas's actions as heroic. More people saw them as foolish, worse, as proof that he'd genuinely gone over, that he valued Ute lives more than his own community. The worst came from the church. Reverend Hutchins delivered a sermon about the temptation of pride, about men who thought themselves saviors, about the dangers of exceeding one's proper place in God's order. He didn't mention Thomas by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. Margaret sat in the pew with her shoulders rigid, and Catherine didn't go to church at all. But something else happened too. The mill received orders from people in surrounding territories who cared less about Thomas's choice of alliance and more about the quality of his grain. The work expanded. Thomas had to hire more workers, which meant more wages, which meant more families stayed in the valley instead of leaving for the city. A month after returning from the settlement, Thomas received another letter. This one was hand-delivered by Rachel herself, who appeared at the mill on a clear January morning, riding a horse that she handled with casual competence. "Father wanted to be here," Rachel said, "but I insisted on coming myself. I wanted to see the mill." Thomas gave her a tour. She asked intelligent questions about processing, about distribution, about the ratio of grain to waste. When they were done, she handed him the letter. Inside was an offer. Running Bear wanted to expand grain production on Ute territory. He wanted Thomas to oversee the operation not as a hired manager, but as a partner. Equal share of profits, full authority over the work, a position that would formalize what had begun informally. "He also wanted me to tell you something," Rachel said as Thomas read. "He said that being a bridge between 2 worlds means building with materials from both sides. He's building with you. But you get to choose what you contribute." "What if the town decides that's too much?" Thomas asked. Rachel smiled, a real smile, not the careful expression people usually offered. "Then the town will have chosen to remain small. Father says the world is bigger than Millbrook's comfort, And he's betting on the fact that you know that too. She stayed for supper with Thomas and his daughters. Margaret, cautious at first, found herself engaged in conversation about healing plants and community building. Catherine asked technical questions about water irrigation and farming techniques. By the end of the evening, there was something like friendship forming, careful, tentative, but real. After Rachel left, Thomas stood alone in the mill, listening to the great wheel turn in the darkness. It made a sound like breathing, like life moving through wood and metal and stone. He thought about choices, the ones he'd made and the ones that had been made for him. He thought about bridges and the people brave enough to stand in the middle, holding both sides. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and forgiving. The world was vast and full of people trying to survive it. And Thomas Whitmore, who'd once thought his only choice was between failure and surrender, had discovered a third option, to build something that belonged to no one entirely, that gave shelter to everyone. The mill would survive the winter, and more importantly, so would the bridge. Spring brought transformation, and with it, unexpected complications. The snow melted into rushing water that carved new paths down the mountainside, and the valley awakened hungry for commerce, for news from the outside world, for someone to blame for the fact that Millbrook was no longer the center of anything that mattered. Thomas had accepted Running Bear's partnership offer, and the decision had consequences that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The grain operation expanded rapidly. Workers arrived from surrounding territories. A trading post opened on neutral ground between Millbrook and Ute territory, staffed by people from both communities. The mill ran full capacity, processing grain that came from lands Thomas managed, working with people Thomas had brought into the valley. It was success that tasted like ash to half the town. The first real sign of trouble came through the bank. Mr. Ashford, who'd seemed relieved to save the mill, called Thomas in on a grey April morning. The banker's hands were shaking as he poured coffee neither of them would drink. "There's talk of forming a Millbrook Protection League," Ashford said without preamble. "Businessmen mostly. They're concerned that your operations are drawing business away from town establishments. They're organizing to—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to say the rest. "To what?" Thomas asked, though he already knew. "To make life difficult for anyone who trades with you. They've got considerable power. They could convince the bank to call in debts. They could encourage suppliers to refuse service. They could spread rumors about the quality of your grain." Thomas leaned back in his chair. The banker's office suddenly felt very small, the walls pressing in. "And you're telling me this because—" "Because I won't be part of it," Ashford said quietly. "And because if they succeed, it won't just hurt you. It'll hurt everyone in this territory who's built something on trade between the communities. It'll hurt the people who work for you. It'll hurt my bank eventually, because the economy of this whole region is shifting. They don't see that yet. They're just scared. What do they want? They want you out. They want the trading post closed. They want the Ute territory isolated again." Ashford looked genuinely pained. "They want things to go back to how they were, and they don't care that how they were was slowly strangling everyone." That afternoon, Thomas called a meeting at the mill. He invited Catherine and Margaret, Running Bear's 3 daughters who were now regular presences at the operation, and the foreman of the grain workers, a man named David Cole, who'd come from his father's failed ranch to help build something new. "We have a problem," Thomas said, and laid out what Ashford had told him. The responses came quickly. Rachel wanted to take the issue to Running Bear directly. Sarah wanted to expose the Protection League's plans publicly. Catherine wanted to counter with their own propaganda. David, surprisingly, wanted to wait. "They're scared," David said. "Scared people make threats, but threats are words. Let them talk. Let them organize. What they can't organize is the fact that we're building something that actually works, and their world is failing. Time is on our side. Time might run out before their organization does." Margaret pointed out. She'd been quiet until now, but her voice cut through the debate with the practicality that came from managing a household on nothing. If they convince the suppliers to stop shipping to the mill, we can't process grain. If we can't process grain, our whole operation collapses. Then we find different suppliers, Rachel said. From where? Margaret asked. The territories that supply this region are all within the Protection League's sphere of influence. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the problem. Thomas felt it settling on his shoulders, the familiar pressure of being a man whose choices had consequences he couldn't control. It was Sarah who finally spoke, and when she did, her voice carried the same quiet authority Thomas had heard in the fever tent. We're thinking about this wrong. We're thinking about defense, about protecting what we have. But what they're actually trying to do is erase us. You don't erase something by making it smaller. You erase it by making it less real. Everyone looked at her, waiting. We make ourselves more real, Sarah continued. Not to Millbrook, to the region. We invite people to see what we've built. We show them that this works not because we say so, but because they see it with their own eyes. An open house, Catherine said, understanding. Invite people from the surrounding territories, show them the operation, show them the partnership working. More than that, Sarah said. A festival, a harvest festival, even though harvest is months away. A day where people from every territory come together. They'll see the trading post, they'll see the mill. They'll see Ute and Settler and everyone else working side by side. Millbrook won't support that, Margaret said. Millbrook doesn't have to, Sarah replied. It just has to happen on territory they can't control. The planning took weeks. Thomas and the partnership worked with Running Bear to secure neutral ground, a large meadow that sat exactly on the border between Ute territory and settler land. They sent invitations to trading posts throughout the region, to ranchers and farmers and merchants who'd all been affected by the boom in grain production. They arranged for entertainment, musicians, storytellers, people who could turn a business summit into something that felt like celebration. The Protection League learned about the festival 3 weeks before it was scheduled. Their response came through a letter delivered to the mill by the town's sheriff, a different man from the one who'd warned Thomas years ago. This sheriff was younger, less inclined toward nuance. They're saying the festival is an insult to Millbrook, the sheriff said, handing over the letter. They're saying you're flaunting your betrayal. They're asking me to stop it. Thomas opened the letter. Inside was a list of demands. The festival would not happen. If it did happen, anyone from Millbrook who attended would be publicly shamed. Businesses would be boycotted. Credit would be revoked. The letter was signed by 12 names, the core of the Protection League. What are you going to do? The sheriff asked. Hold the festival, Thomas said. The day arrived bright and impossible, the kind of spring day that made people believe in resurrection and second chances. Thomas woke before dawn and couldn't sleep again, his mind running through everything that could go wrong. But by mid-morning, when the first wagons began arriving at the meadow, he found his anxiety settling into something closer to purpose. People came, dozens of them at first, then hundreds. Ranchers from 3 territories over, merchants from the mountain settlements, Ute families who brought food and music and stories. A Cheyenne trader who'd heard about the festival through connections to Running Bear. Even a few people from Millbrook workers and their families, people who lived between the official rejection and practical necessity. Thomas had worried that the festival would feel like a political statement, a deliberate affront. Instead, it felt like what it actually was, a gathering of people who had business to conduct and a shared interest in not starving. Transactions happened, alliances formed. Someone brought a fiddle and someone else brought a drum, and by afternoon there was music and dancing happening near the food tables. Sarah found Thomas watching from the edge of the gathering. She was holding a plate of food, looking less tense than he'd seen her in weeks. Your friends from town are noticeably absent, she observed. The Protection League, you mean? All of them. Every person old enough to vote who was on that list. Sarah gestured toward the festival. They're not here, but their workers are, their suppliers are, their customers are. They decided not to come to something that was going to happen anyway, and now they're not here to shape what it becomes. As the afternoon turned to evening, Thomas realized something important. The festival didn't feel like a victory over the Protection League. It felt like something they'd simply become irrelevant to. The League had defined itself in opposition to this thing, and now this thing existed and had validity independent of their approval or rejection. They hadn't been defeated, they'd been made unnecessary. Running Bear appeared as the sun was setting, and Thomas was struck by how easily the chief moved through the crowd. People greeted him. Conversations happened. Children who'd never known him except as a threat asked him questions about horses and hunting. He answered patiently, treating them with the same respect he'd shown adults. "Your Protection League didn't come," Running Bear said when he found Thomas. "No. They will decide this proves they were right to fear. They will make themselves smaller with that decision. It is their loss. Will they stop trying to sabotage the operation? Some will be too proud to stop." Running Bear's face was carved by sunset into something almost gentle. But they've learned something important. They learned that they cannot control what happens in the space between our worlds, and that knowledge will change them, whether they want it to or not. As darkness fell, the festival continued. Someone built a bonfire. The music grew louder. People stayed later than they probably should have, reluctant to let this thing end. Thomas watched Rebecca showing Margaret how to dance in the Ute style, a teaching moment that would have been impossible 2 years ago. He thought about Running Bear's daughters, about how they'd transformed from abstract concepts into people smart, capable, fully realized humans with their own agendas and dreams. He thought about how his own daughters had grown into the space between worlds, learning languages and customs, building relationships that crossed boundaries everyone said were uncrossable. He thought about the Protection League sitting in Millbrook, nursing their fear, making themselves irrelevant through the simple act of refusing to show up. By the time the festival ended in the early morning hours, something fundamental had shifted. Not a defeat of the opposition, but a transcendence of it. The work that mattered was happening in the space where people chose to build together. And that space, it turned out, was getting bigger every day. When Thomas finally rode back to the mill with Margaret and Catherine, the sky was turning pink with approaching dawn. He was exhausted in a way that felt earned, like he'd been carrying something heavy and finally been allowed to set it down. "They'll come back," Margaret said quietly as they rode. "The Protection League. They won't accept this." "Maybe," Thomas agreed. "But they'll have to accept that we're not going anywhere. That changes everything." And in the pink light of dawn, with his daughters riding beside him and the vast valley spreading out before them, Thomas Whitmore understood that Running Bear had given him something far more valuable than work or partnership. He'd given him the chance to become someone who mattered not because the town had validated him, but because he'd chosen to build something worth building, and had refused to let fear determine his worth. The bridge held, and in holding, it became stronger with every person who crossed it. Summer arrived with unexpected intensity. The grain grew tall and golden, the operation expanded beyond what anyone had projected, and Thomas found himself facing a problem he'd never anticipated. Success brought its own kind of pressure. It came first through a letter from a merchant consortium in Denver. They'd heard about the quality of grain being produced at the mill. They wanted a contract, enormous quantities, regular shipments, guaranteed pricing. The numbers were staggering. They offered payments that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. But the contract required something Thomas hadn't bargained for. His personal signature, his sole ownership stake, his individual accountability. It required him to sign as the operator of the mill, not as part of a partnership. It required him to legally separate himself from Running Bear's involvement and make the operation unmistakably his. He brought the contract to a meeting with Running Bear and his daughters. They sat in the extended cabin that had become a secondary office, the summer heat making the space feel close despite the open windows. "They want you to own it," Running Bear said, reading through the document carefully. He handed it to Sarah without comment. "They want exclusivity," Sarah said, her voice analytical. "They want to know this comes from one source, managed by one person. They don't trust distributed authority." "Can you trust it?" Rachel asked Thomas directly. The question hung in the air. Thomas had learned enough about Running Bear's world to understand what she was really asking. Were you ever intending to take this solely for yourself? Was the partnership always temporary? "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "A year ago, I would have taken it without hesitation. I was desperate enough that sole ownership would have felt like salvation. Now," he trailed off, genuinely uncertain. "Now, you're not that man anymore," Rebecca said quietly. She was the youngest and often spoke truths others skirted around. "So you need to decide who you want to be instead." The contract sat on the table for 3 weeks. Thomas didn't bring it home to his daughters. He didn't discuss it with David Cole or the workers. He carried it in his mind constantly, the weight of it more present than the physical paper. During that time, something unexpected happened. Margaret met someone. His name was James Harrick, and he was a surveyor's assistant working on mapping the new territorial boundaries that the growth of trade had necessitated. He came through the mill one afternoon with land documents that needed Thomas's signature, and Margaret was helping with the paperwork. By the time James left, he'd asked Margaret if he could return on the following Sunday. Margaret, who'd spent the last 3 years putting her own life on hold to help her father survive, suddenly had someone looking at her like she mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with competence or duty. Thomas watched it happen with a complicated mixture of joy and something else, something that felt close to fear. James came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after, he was from one of the territories bordering Millbrook, the son of a rancher who'd decided the land had more promise if it participated in trade rather than resisted it. He was thoughtful and kind, and he looked at Margaret like she was the most interesting person he'd ever met. One evening, Thomas found them sitting on the porch of the mill, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. They were talking quietly, Margaret's face lit with something Thomas hadn't seen there in years, hope that wasn't tied to survival, joy that wasn't purchased through sacrifice. "He's asked to court her properly," Catherine said from behind him. She'd come up quietly, the way she'd learned to move in the spaces between territories. "What do you think?" Thomas asked. "I think Margaret's been waiting long enough to have a life that isn't about keeping us afloat," Catherine said simply. "I think she deserves someone who sees her as more than a strong pair of hands. And I think you need to let her go, Father, or you'll lose her in ways that can't be fixed." After she walked away, Thomas stood alone, watching his oldest daughter laugh at something James had said. The realization came with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on building the partnership, on managing the operation, on navigating the space between communities, that he'd stopped asking what his daughters actually wanted. The contract from Denver was still unsigned. That week, Thomas made a decision. He didn't sign the contract as a sole proprietor. Instead, he drafted a new agreement, one that made the partnership with Running Bear legally binding, that gave the Ute territory formal ownership stake in the operation, that ensured no single person could control what they'd built together. He brought the revised contract to Running Bear and his daughters. "This is madness," Rachel said, reading the new terms. "This gives away your leverage. Denver won't sign this." "Probably not," Thomas agreed. "But then Denver wasn't actually asking me to choose something different. They were asking me to choose profit over principle. I've already made that choice once, and I chose principle. I'm not changing my answer now." Running Bear studied the document for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. He didn't say anything. He just placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder and held it there, a gesture that communicated what words couldn't. Sarah smiled. "You've become something rare, Thomas Whitmore. A man who means what he says. Running Bear sent the revised contract back to Denver with a letter explaining the structure. To everyone's surprise, the merchant consortium signed it. They wanted the grain badly enough to accept the partnership model. The contract went through, but the real change came in what happened next. 2 weeks after signing, Running Bear appeared at the mill with a proposal of his own. He wanted to bring more Ute families into the operation, not as workers, but as partners. He wanted to formalize a governance structure that made decisions collectively, that valued both Ute and settler knowledge equally, that created something that couldn't be controlled or corrupted by any single person's ambitions. "I'm getting older," Running Bear said simply. "My daughters are becoming the future. But I need to know that when I'm gone, what we've built doesn't fall apart because one person decides to become greedy. We bind it together with principles, not just profit. We make it impossible for any single leader to destroy it." The proposal was radical. It meant Thomas would share decision-making power not just with Running Bear and his daughters, but with representatives from Ute families, settler workers, and eventually representatives from other territories. It meant his authority would be limited. It meant he would never have absolute control over what he'd built. He signed the proposal without hesitation. Word of the new structure spread through the territories faster than Thomas expected. Some people praised it as visionary, some people criticized it as complicated and slow. But the merchants in Denver didn't care about the politics. They only cared that the grain kept flowing, that quality remained consistent, that contracts were honored. The grain did keep flowing. The quality remained consistent. The contracts were honored. And slowly, other operations began adopting similar governance structures: a timber partnership, a cattle operation, a trading post network. What had started as one man's attempt to navigate between two worlds was becoming a model for how communities could build things together. By autumn, the mill was employing 40 workers directly, with hundreds more involved in the network of supply and trade. The cabin that had once housed just Thomas and his daughters had become the center of a growing community. People came and went constantly: Running Bear's family, David Cole and his crew, workers and traders and representatives from other territories. It was overwhelming sometimes. Thomas would stand in the corner of the expanded workspace and feel the weight of all those decisions, all those relationships, all those people depending on systems he'd helped build. It was James who found him one evening, sitting alone by the creek that ran behind the mill. "Margaret's mother was a good woman," James said without preamble, sitting down beside Thomas. "Margaret told me stories about her. She sounds like someone who would have liked what you've built here." "I don't know if she would have," Thomas said honestly. "She died thinking we were going to lose everything. She never got to see that there might be another way." "But Margaret got to see it," James pointed out. "And Catherine, and they're different because of that. Margaret told me she feels like her life is actually hers now, not just borrowed from someone else's crisis." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creek move over stones. "I'm going to ask her to marry me," James said eventually. "I wanted you to know before I asked her. I know you've relied on her heavily, and I wanted to make sure you weren't going to fall apart if she said yes." Thomas felt something shift inside him. The old fear, the terror of losing what little he had didn't come. Instead, what came was something closer to peace. "When are you going to ask her?" "Tonight. During the harvest meal. If you think that's all right." "It's more than all right," Thomas said. "It's exactly what should happen." That evening, James asked Margaret in front of everyone, Running Bear and his daughters, Catherine, David Cole and the workers, the representatives from other territories who'd come for the harvest gathering. Margaret said yes, with tears streaming down her face, and the whole group erupted in celebration. Thomas watched his daughter surrounded by people who cared about her future and realized that somewhere in the last year he'd stopped being the only person she could depend on. The mill had become a community, the partnership had become a network, and his role had shifted from desperate survivor to something stranger and more meaningful, a man who helped create space where others could thrive. Later that night, as the celebration continued around him, Thomas stepped outside. The stars were impossibly bright, the autumn air carrying the scent of harvest and coming winter. He thought about Running Bear's original offer, the chance to marry his daughters, to legitimize their claim, to save himself through sacrifice. Instead, what had happened was far more transformative. He'd learned that the deepest connection between people wasn't about possession or obligation. It was about building something together that belonged to everyone and no one. It was about creating systems that were too large for any single person to control. It was about making yourself necessary, not because people depended on you, but because you'd chosen to matter. Running Bear joined him at the edge of the light, as if he'd known Thomas would need company in that moment. "Your daughters are going to be fine," Running Bear said. "More than fine. They're going to build things we can't even imagine yet." "And Margaret?" Thomas asked. "Will find happiness with a good man, and will never again have to sacrifice her own dreams to hold up someone else's survival." Running Bear smiled slightly. "This is what I wanted, you know. Not to tie you to my daughters through marriage, but to build a world where my daughters could be free and your daughters could be free, and all the children born into this structure could be free." As the celebration continued inside, Thomas stood with Running Bear under the stars. Two men from incompatible worlds who'd chosen to build a bridge instead of maintaining a wall. The bridge held, and in holding, it had become something neither of them had fully anticipated, not a compromise between two ways of living, but a genuinely new way of being together. The harvest moon rose over the valley, painting everything silver and gold, and in that light, the impossible had become so commonplace that no one even noticed anymore how radical it actually was. 2 years after Margaret's wedding, Thomas stood in a place he never thought he'd return to, Millbrook's main street, on a clear spring afternoon when the town was gathered for what had been announced as a community meeting. The Protection League had officially dissolved the year before, not with a dramatic announcement, but through quiet irrelevance. As the network of partnerships expanded, as settlers and Ute and people from a dozen other territories did business together without apology, the League's opposition became nothing more than old men muttering about the way things used to be. The young people simply hadn't listened. But today's gathering was different. This wasn't about trade or commerce. This was about something Running Bear had initiated, a formal proposal to establish a shared school. Not a settler school or a Ute school, but a real center of learning where children from both communities would study together, taught by educators from multiple traditions. Reverend Hutchins still led the church, and his opposition to the proposal was predictable, but he was no longer the only voice. That mattered. The schoolteacher, Miss Eleanor Webb, had publicly supported the initiative. So had Dr. Mathers, who'd treated Thomas's frostbite years earlier. Even Sheriff Coleman, the man who delivered the Protection League's threats, had grudgingly acknowledged that the partnership model had brought relative peace to the territory. Thomas watched from the back of the room as Running Bear presented the proposal. The Apache Chief had aged visibly in the 2 years since the festival. His hair was almost entirely silver now, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing pain. But his voice remained steady. His presence still commanded attention. "Education is not about changing who you are," Running Bear said. "It is about expanding what you can understand. Our children need to know mathematics and history and languages, but they also need to know each other. They need to grow up understanding that people different from themselves are not threats, they are possibilities." The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. The school would be built. Running Bear's daughters would oversee the curriculum, working with teachers from Millbrook and other territories. Thomas had been asked to serve on the oversight committee, though he'd requested that David Cole take the more active role, another conscious step toward making himself less central. After the meeting, as people filed out, Thomas was approached by someone he hadn't expected, Reverend Hutchins himself. The minister was older than Thomas remembered, his face creased by years of certainty and doubt in equal measure. He extended his hand, and Thomas shook it cautiously. "I owe you an apology," Hutchins said quietly, "for the sermon I delivered when you first began this partnership, for not understanding what you were actually doing." Thomas didn't know what to say. An apology from the man who'd preached against him was unexpected enough to short-circuit his usual responses. "I told my congregation that boundaries were God's design," Hutchins continued. "That crossing them was sin. But I've watched your operation these past 2 years. I've seen how people treat each other. I've seen the care. And I've come to believe that perhaps God is less interested in maintaining boundaries than in teaching us to cross them with integrity." It was a small statement, but it carried weight. The Reverend wasn't converting to support the partnership entirely, but he'd moved from active opposition to cautious acknowledgement. In small towns, that shift mattered. The school opened that autumn, built on land that Running Bear had donated neutral territory between Millbrook and Ute lands. The first class had 32 students, 17 settler children, 15 from Ute families. They ranged from age 6 to age 14, creating a multi-generational learning environment that none of the teachers had anticipated, but which quickly proved effective. Catherine became the primary educator, with Sarah handling administration and Rachel managing the material logistics. Rebecca, surprisingly, took on the role of bridge builder, working with settler parents who remained uncomfortable with the arrangement, easing their fears through quiet competence and genuine respect. Thomas was there on opening day, watching children of both communities enter the same building, sit at the same tables, begin learning from the same instructors. It was a small thing in some ways, just a classroom and a teacher and curious minds, but it was also radical. In another generation, the people learning together today would be the merchants, the ranchers, the leaders. They would negotiate with each other not as foreign entities, but as people who'd grown up understanding each other. That winter, Running Bear became ill. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow. The kind of illness that comes when a body simply decides it's tired of carrying on. Thomas found out from Sarah, who came to the mill with exhaustion written into her face like permanent ink. "He's asking for you," she said. "He won't say why, but he's specific about it. He wants you to visit." Thomas found Running Bear in the cabin that had become a secondary residence for the chief, a place where he could maintain privacy while still being accessible to the growing network of people who depended on his counsel. The Apache Chief was sitting by a window, wrapped in blankets despite the fire burning in the stove. "I'm dying," Running Bear said without preamble. "The healer agrees. Maybe winter, maybe spring. Enough time to say important things to important people." Thomas didn't know what to do with this bluntness. He found a chair and sat. "I called you because I wanted you to understand something," Running Bear continued. "When I first sent that letter, when I made you the offer about my daughters, I was desperate. I was trying to save my people through connection, and I was willing to use anyone necessary to do it, including you. I want you to know that, and I want you to know that I've regretted it." "You regret asking me?" Thomas asked, confused. "I regret trying to manipulate you into something, even for good reasons. What made it work wasn't the arrangement I proposed. It was that you refused it and offered something better instead." Running Bear turned to look at Thomas directly. "You gave me back my own agency. You showed me that I didn't have to control outcomes to protect my people. I just had to build systems strong enough that they could protect themselves." They sat in silence for a while. "My daughters will be fine without me," Running Bear said eventually. "Sarah is shrewd, Rachel is capable, Rebecca is wise. Catherine, she's becoming what I wanted you to be when I first met you, a bridge. And your Catherine, she's the same. That's not chance. You raised a daughter who could do what I needed done, and I'm grateful for that." "What happens when you're gone?" Thomas asked carefully. "The partnership continues. Sarah will take the formal leadership role, but it won't be like having a chief. It will be like what we've built, distributed, shared, impossible for any one person to control." Running Bear smiled slightly. I'm making sure of that. In my will, I've established that no single person can make decisions above a certain threshold. Every major choice goes to the collective. It will be slow sometimes, but it will be just. Running Bear passed away in late February during a snowstorm that seemed to acknowledge the passing of something significant. Over 200 people came to the funeral, settlers and Ute, and people from territories bordering both communities. The ceremony blended traditions, honoring Running Bear's Apache heritage while acknowledging the many communities he'd touched. Thomas spoke, though he hadn't planned to. Running Bear gave me a choice, he said to the gathered crowd. He offered me marriage as a solution to my desperation, and when I refused, he offered me partnership instead. But what he actually gave me, what he gave all of us, was permission to imagine something different. Permission to believe that we didn't have to accept the boundaries other people had drawn for us. That's his real legacy, not the school or the mill or the trading network. The legacy is that we learned to see each other as possible. After the funeral, there was a period of transition that everyone had anticipated would be chaotic. It wasn't. Sarah stepped into leadership with the kind of quiet competence that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment since childhood. Rachel immediately began implementing the governance structure their father had established in his will, ensuring that the partnership operated on principles rather than personalities. But something unexpected happened. Millbrook began to change on its own. The young people who'd grown up seeing the partnership work, who'd attended the school where settler and Ute children learned together, began to make different choices than their parents. Some of them moved to the mill's operations, choosing to work in the integrated system. Some married across the old boundaries, creating families that claimed both heritages. Some simply left traditional Millbrook life entirely to build new communities that followed the partnership model. The town didn't disappear, but it did shrink. The ones who left were the young, the ambitious, the ones who could imagine different futures. What remained was the conservative core people who'd decided that the old way was the right way, and who were content to maintain their boundaries and their certainties. It was Rebecca who pointed out the irony when she visited Thomas one spring morning, 3 years after Running Bear's death. "Millbrook is getting exactly what they feared," she said. "They resisted integration so hard that they pushed away everyone who might have changed them. Now, they're isolated not by us, but by their own choices." "Does that bother you?" Thomas asked. "No," Rebecca said simply. "Because the people who left Millbrook to join us, they're building something. They're not running from something. They're running towards something. That's different." By the 5th anniversary of the school's opening, the institution had expanded. There was now a secondary campus dedicated to advanced learning mathematics, natural philosophy, languages beyond English and Ute. Young people came from neighboring territories to attend. Some went on to university in Denver or beyond. Some returned to establish their own partnerships in other territories. Catherine, now in her 20s, had become the assistant director of the advanced campus. She was engaged to be married to David Cole, a partnership that had surprised no one who'd watched them work together for years. They were planning to establish a mill in the Southern Territories, using the partnership model to bring integrated commerce to communities that had never known anything but conflict. Margaret, now with 2 children of her own, had become a teacher at the primary school. James had proved to be exactly the kind of partner Thomas would have wanted for his daughter, supportive of her ambitions, genuinely engaged with the community. A man who understood that Margaret's intelligence was a feature to be celebrated, not an inconvenience to be managed. Thomas himself had stepped back from daily operations. At 52, his hands bore the marks of a lifetime of work, and he found that he was content to oversee rather than manage, to advise rather than decide. The mill ran well without him at the center. The partnership thrived on its own momentum. One evening, he sat on the porch of what had once been his failing grain mill, now a thriving center of commerce and learning, and watched the sun set over the valley. Sarah approached and sat beside him, as she often did in the evenings. "Father always said that you became something rare," she said. "A man who learned to let go." "I didn't have much choice," Thomas replied. "I was desperate enough that I would have held on to anything if I thought it would save me. But you can't build something that lasts when you're holding on that tight. It breaks under the weight of your own fear." "He also said," Sarah continued, "that the greatest gift you gave us wasn't your labor or your intelligence. It was your willingness to be transformed by what you learned. You came to us as a desperate man, you left as a visionary, but you had to stop being desperate first." They sat in silence as darkness gathered around them. In the distance, lights came on in the school building. The evening classes were beginning. Young people from multiple communities, learning together, building relationships that would shape the future. Thomas thought about the letter that had arrived all those years ago. He thought about standing at the ridge, watching the sun set, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. He thought about the moment he decided to refuse, and how that refusal had opened more doors than any acceptance could have. "Do you think your father knew?" Thomas asked. "When he sent that letter, did he know that I would refuse?" Sarah smiled. "I think he hoped, I think he understood that the kind of man who needed that letter was exactly the kind of man who might have the capacity to transcend his own desperation. But he couldn't have known for certain. That's what made it brave on both sides." As the stars emerged, Thomas Whitmore sat on the porch of a mill that no longer belonged to him alone, watching the lights of a school that belonged to everyone, and understood that sometimes the greatest choice was the one that made you stop thinking about yourself and start thinking about what could be built together. The valley below was full of light and possibility, and in that light, the boundaries that had once seemed so rigid, so permanent, so absolutely essential to maintain, had become not boundaries at all, just stories people had chosen to tell themselves about who could and couldn't belong to the same world. The impossible had become inevitable, and that was the real bridge, not the structures they'd built, but the understanding that had grown in the space between two communities that had learned, finally, to see each other as possible. Thomas was 61 years old when the letter arrived from San Francisco. It came addressed to him specifically, not to the partnership or the operation, but to Thomas Whitmore as an individual. His name was written in an elegant hand, and the envelope bore the seal of a law office. Inside was a letter that would unravel everything he'd spent 15 years building. Eleanor Whitmore, the letter explained, was his cousin, not a distant cousin, but a direct line, his father's sister's daughter, someone he'd never met because Eleanor had left the territory as a young woman and never looked back. She'd become successful in California, very successful. She'd built a mercantile empire, and she'd recently discovered that she was dying. Eleanor had no children, she had substantial assets. And she'd discovered, through a private investigator, that Thomas existed, the only other person with the Whitmore name who shared her bloodline. She wanted to meet him, she wanted to understand who he was. And, the letter implied, she wanted to discuss what would happen to her considerable fortune when she died. The numbers listed in the letter made Thomas sit down hard. They made him question everything. They made him, for the first time in 15 years, feel that pull of old desperation, the possibility that rescue might still be possible, that one final gesture of fortune might allow him to secure something beyond what the partnership could guarantee. He told no one at first. He read the letter 3 times, then carefully placed it in a locked box. But secrets have a way of becoming visible to people who know you well. Sarah noticed his distraction. Catherine observed the way he stared at horizons he wasn't actually seeing. Margaret, with the particular insight of daughters, simply asked him directly, "What happened?" He showed her the letter. Margaret read it slowly, then handed it back without comment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "She's dying. She wants to meet me. I've never had family outside of you and Catherine. And the money," he trailed off. unable to finish the sentence that carried such weight. "The money could do what?" Margaret prompted, not unkindly. "It could ensure that the partnership survives independently of any individual. It could provide security for generations. It could create a foundation that could expand the model to other territories without depending on the current people. Or," Margaret said carefully, "it could tempt you to believe that you need to save the partnership yourself. That's what happened with the Denver contract, isn't it? You were offered something substantial, and you had to choose whether to take it." "This is different," Thomas said. "This is family. Family you've never met," Margaret pointed out. "Family who wants to meet you now only because she's dying and you're her bloodline. That doesn't make her wrong or mean her death isn't tragic. But it also doesn't obligate you to become something different than you are." Despite Margaret's caution, Thomas decided to go to San Francisco. He told the partnership that he needed to handle a personal matter. He didn't mention the inheritance possibility. He simply said he would return in 6 weeks. Sarah's expression when he told her was unreadable. "Your father would tell you to be careful with family," she said finally. "He said families can trap us as easily as they can sustain us." San Francisco was chaos and wonder, a city so vast and aggressive that Thomas felt immediately small. Eleanor's mansion was in the better part of the city, overlooking the bay, built on mercantile success that made Thomas's mill operation look like child's play. Eleanor herself was not what he expected. She was nearly 70, thin in the way that came from illness rather than hardship, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She received him in a sitting room that cost more to furnish than his entire mill operation had cost to build. "You look like father," she said instead of greeting him. "The same set to your shoulders, same way of assessing a room before you enter it fully." They talked for hours that first day. Eleanor told him about leaving the territory, about the man she'd married, about building a business in a city where being ruthless was the only currency that mattered. She told him about the fortune she'd accumulated, the influence she'd developed, the loneliness that had accompanied all of it. "I never had children," she said. "I thought children would slow me down, and I was right. They would have. I was too, ambitious to be a good mother. But I became something else instead, someone who built things that lasted. Only the things I built weren't for anyone in particular. They were just things, abstractions, money, power." She showed him her will. The numbers were staggering. $50,000, an amount that would have seemed impossible to Thomas years ago, but which he now understood in different terms. It was enough to buy land, to establish a foundation, to secure the partnership in ways that didn't depend on any individual's contribution. "I'm giving it to you," Eleanor said, "because you're the only person I've ever met who turned down money for principle." "I've never met you before," Thomas pointed out. "You don't know anything about me." "I've had you investigated extensively," Eleanor said, without apology. "I know that you were offered a contract in Denver that would have made you wealthy, and you restructured it to share power. I know that you were offered a partnership that would have benefited you personally, and you made it benefited everyone. I know that you're not a good man because you're virtuous. You're a good man because you've learned that virtue is practical. It actually works better than selfishness in building things that last." Thomas spent 3 weeks with Eleanor. She grew progressively weaker as the weeks passed, her body slowly surrendering to the illness that had brought Thomas to her in the first place. On his final day, she made him promise to use the money for something that mattered. "Don't give it to the partnership," she instructed. "That would be too easy, too obvious. You've already built partnership. Build something new. Build something that your partnership doesn't expect." She died 2 days after he left. Thomas returned to Colorado with Eleanor's will in his possession and the weight of $50,000 hanging over him like both blessing and curse. He called a meeting of the partnership's governance collective, all 23 voting members, representing the different communities and operations that had grown from the original mill. "I've inherited money," he said plainly, "a substantial amount, and I need this group to help me decide what to do with it." He expected resistance or suggestions or debate. What he got was Sarah's quiet voice asking the question that mattered. "What do you want to do with it?" Thomas realized he didn't have an answer. He'd spent so long responding to circumstances, refusing offers, accepting partnerships, maintaining operations, that he'd never actually decided what he wanted to build for its own sake. "I don't know," he admitted. Eleanor said not to give it to the partnership. She said to build something new. Rachel, who'd become deeply involved in long-term planning, leaned forward. What did Eleanor build? What did she spend her life on that meant something to her? "Power," Thomas said. "Commerce. Control. And did that make her happy?" Rachel asked. "No," Thomas said. "It made her efficient. It made her lonely." "Then what would be the opposite?" Rachel pressed. "What would be something that built connection instead of power? Something that brought people together instead of controlling them?" The question hung in the room, and slowly an answer began to form. Catherine spoke first. "There are territories beyond us, places where communities still see themselves as enemies, places where the model hasn't reached because there's no economic incentive for it." "The mountain territories," David Cole added, understanding where she was going. "The towns that are too small for the mill operation to reach. The communities that depend on single industries and collapse when those industries fail." "Eleanor's money could fund an intentional expansion," Sarah said. "Not through commerce, but through education. We could establish schools in those territories. We could teach the partnership model before people had economic incentive to believe in it. We could build culture before necessity forced them to change." By the end of the meeting, the vision had crystallized. A foundation. Eleanor Whitmore's Foundation for Integrated Communities. Not a charity, but something more structured. Seed funding for schools, support for communities attempting integration, resources for conflict mediation and cultural exchange. The money would stretch further if they used it strategically. Maybe not enough for 100 communities, but enough for 10, perhaps 15. Enough to create islands of integration that might eventually connect into something larger. Thomas established the foundation with Catherine as the first director. The decision surprised everyone except Margaret, who simply nodded as if she'd expected it all along. Catherine was in her mid-20s, educated, fluent in multiple languages and cultural contexts. She understood both the practical and philosophical dimensions of what they'd built. "What if it fails?" Catherine asked, when Thomas offered her the position. "Then it fails," Thomas said. "But if you don't try, we'll never know what was possible." The first school, funded by Eleanor Whitmore's foundation, opened in a small town called Silverton 18 months later. It was a scaled-down version of the original school, smaller, simpler, but built on the same principles of integrated learning and cultural exchange. The town's response was mixed. Some people embraced it. Some actively resisted. But there were enough people willing to try, enough parents who wanted their children to have opportunities beyond what Silverton's traditional isolation could offer. Catherine made monthly visits, observing, adjusting, supporting the local teachers. She sent reports back to the partnership, detailed analyses of what worked and what didn't, recommendations for how to refine the model for different community contexts. Back in Colorado, the original partnership continued its evolution. Margaret and James had opened a second mill in the south, working specifically with smaller ranchers and farmers who'd previously been excluded from commerce. Sarah had begun diplomatic work with territories further away, exploring whether the partnership model could be adapted for different economic systems. Rebecca, now nearly 40, had become the community's unofficial counselor and mediator, the person people came to when conflicts arose. But Thomas found himself increasingly peripheral to the daily work. He was still consulted, still respected, but the operations no longer depended on his presence. It was exactly what he'd worked toward, a system that could function without him. Yet now that he'd achieved it, he felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but displacement. One evening, He sat with Sarah on the porch of the expanded cabin that had become the partnership's central office. "I feel like I'm becoming invisible," Thomas said. "I built something, and now that it works, I'm no longer necessary to it." "My father felt this too," Sarah said, at the end. "He said the mark of success was becoming irrelevant. But what happens to a man who becomes irrelevant?" "He gets to live," Sarah said simply. "He gets to stop fighting. He gets to sit on porches and watch what he's built continue without him. He gets to age without the weight of responsibility crushing his spine. He gets to choose what matters to him for reasons that have nothing to do with obligation." "What matters to me?" Thomas asked. "That's the question you get to answer now," Sarah said. "For the first time in your life, you're free to do something simply because you want to. My father never had that. His choices were always about survival, about legacy, about obligation. You had one choice, the choice to refuse, and it changed everything. Now you get to see what happens next." Thomas began to travel. Not desperately seeking something, but deliberately exploring. He visited the schools funded by Eleanor's foundation. He sat in classrooms where settler and Ute children and children from other communities entirely learned mathematics from teachers who came from both worlds. He listened to the debates between students from different backgrounds, watched the slow transformation of young minds, learning to see complexity instead of certainty. In Silverton, he met a woman named Margaret. She was a teacher, 5 years younger than Thomas, widowed and without children. She'd come to Silverton specifically to work in the foundation school, believing in the mission more than she needed security or status. They spent time together simply because they both found each other interesting. There was no desperation in it, no need for rescue or salvation, just two people late in their lives discovering that companionship could be chosen rather than necessitated. Margaret asked him once if he'd ever imagined, that day years ago when he'd stood at the ridge with Running Bear, that this was where his life would lead. "I imagined nothing," Thomas said honestly. "I was too desperate to imagine. I could only see the next crisis, the next deadline, the next way things might collapse. Imagination requires some security. I didn't have any until long after the major choices were made." "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked. "The partnership, the choice you made?" "No," Thomas said, "but I don't think I made it out of virtue. I made it because I was too tired to be clever, too broken to pretend. The refusal wasn't noble, it was honest. And sometimes honesty carries more weight than nobility." By the time Thomas turned 65, the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation had established schools in 12 communities. Catherine had trained a core of educators who understood the partnership model and could adapt it to different contexts. The network of integrated communities was beginning to grow in ways that didn't require Thomas's personal presence at all. He spent his days writing not a grand narrative of what they'd built, but smaller pieces, essays about what it meant to choose community over security. Stories about the moments when integration seemed impossible but happened anyway. Reflections on the nature of legacy and what it meant to build something you knew you wouldn't live to see completed. On quiet evenings, sitting with his Margaret in Silverton, watching students from different communities walk together through the town streets, Thomas would think about Eleanor's dying words. "Build something new. Build something that your partnership doesn't expect." He had. And in building it, he'd discovered something unexpected. That the real work of community building wasn't about commerce or operations or even schools. It was about helping people, one conversation at a time, one choice at a time, imagine that the boundaries they'd inherited weren't actually walls, they were just stories. And stories could be rewritten. The young people walking through Silverton's streets weren't proof of success. They were evidence that the story was changing. And that, Thomas understood, was the only immortality that actually mattered, not monuments or wealth or institutional legacy, but the fact that people were living differently because you'd lived differently first. That was enough. The letter came from Denver's territorial court, delivered by a man in a grey suit who looked deeply uncomfortable with his task. The partnership's governance structure, the one Running Bear had designed to prevent any single person from holding absolute power, was being challenged. Someone had filed a legal complaint arguing that the partnership violated Colorado state law regarding property ownership and inheritance rights. Someone had challenged the legitimacy of integrated governance. Someone had decided that 15 years of successful operation wasn't enough evidence that the model was legal. Catherine was the one who brought the letter to Thomas, now nearly 70, living quietly, in Silverton, with Margaret. She'd ridden hard through the morning, her face tight with the kind of anger that comes from knowing injustice is happening and being unable to immediately stop it. "It's Millbrook," Catherine said without preamble. "Several of the old families. They're claiming that because the partnership includes Ute representation and operates on Ute territory, it violates state law regarding native land tenure. They're demanding either the partnership be restructured or the operation be shut down." Thomas read the legal document twice, his aging eyes struggling with the small print, his mind struggling with the implications. The argument wasn't subtle. If Native Americans couldn't own land individually, then they couldn't participate in commercial partnerships. Therefore, the partnership was illegal. Therefore, everything they'd built needed to be unwound. It was clever, it was vicious. It was exactly the kind of argument that worked in courtrooms where men in suits made decisions based on precedent rather than principle. "What does Sarah say?" Thomas asked. "She's furious," Catherine said. "She wants to fight immediately, to hire lawyers, to make this public. But there's a complication. The lawsuit was filed by people who have legitimate standing in Colorado law. These aren't marginal voices we can dismiss. They're landowners, business people, people with money to sustain a legal battle. How long will it take? Years, probably. Depositions, motions, appeals. The lawsuit is designed to be exhausting and expensive regardless of the outcome." Thomas felt something old stir inside him, the weight of crisis, the pressure of needing to solve something unsolvable. He'd thought he was past this. He'd thought becoming peripheral meant being freed from this particular kind of responsibility. He was learning he'd been naive. The legal battle began in earnest that autumn. The partnership hired lawyers from Denver, good ones, experienced ones, but expensive ones. The costs were immediate and substantial. Sarah reported quarterly on legal fees that made even wealthy partners wince. But the real damage wasn't financial. The real damage was the way the lawsuit forced the partnership to constantly justify its existence, to defend in court what had been proven through practice, that integrated communities worked better than segregated ones. Thomas found himself drawn back into the center of things, despite his intentions to remain peripheral. He was asked to testify about the original arrangement, about Running Bear's vision, about the practical success of the partnership model. He agreed, but with a heaviness that made Margaret concerned. "You don't have to do this," she said one evening as they sat, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Yes, I do," Thomas said. "I built this. I'm responsible for it." "You built part of it," Margaret corrected. "Running Bear built part of it. Sarah and Rachel and Rebecca built parts of it. Catherine and Espant. David and dozens of other people built parts of it. You're not solely responsible for defending it." "But I'm the one who refused the original offer," Thomas said. "I'm the one who set everything in motion." "And that choice happened 30 years ago," Margaret said quietly. "You've already paid for it in ways that most men never have to pay. Maybe it's time to let other people carry the weight." But Thomas couldn't let it go. He spent his days preparing testimony, meeting with lawyers, reviewing documents. He spent his nights in Silverton, unable to sleep, his mind working through precedents and legal arguments, his body remembering the familiar pressure of crisis. 3 months into the lawsuit, Sarah came to Silverton to meet with him directly. She looked older, worn in ways that management hadn't worn her before. The lawsuit was aging her visibly, extracting a cost that went beyond money. "The lawyers say we might lose," Sarah said without preamble. "The state law is unclear enough that a judge could rule either way, and if we lose this round, we can appeal. But appeals take years and cost more money. Eventually, we might win on principle, but in the meantime, the partnership will be crippled." "What does Rachel suggest?" Thomas asked. "She suggests we restructure," Sarah said. "Separate the Ute-managed operations from the settler-managed operations, on paper, anyway. Keep everything coordinated informally, but make it legally distinct so there's no question about native land tenure issues." "That's abandoning the model," Thomas said immediately. "That's surviving," Sarah corrected. "My father said that principles are only meaningful if the people holding them survive to implement them. If we lose everything trying to defend the structure, we lose more than we would by restructuring." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at the mountains, the same mountains that had held so many important moments, so many conversations about belonging and choice. "What does your heart say?" he asked finally. "My heart says it's unfair," Sarah said. "My heart says the law is being weaponized against us. My heart says we should fight and win. But my mind says that sometimes you survive by compromising, and you hope that future generations will have the strength to push back further than you could." The partnership made the decision to restructure. Not dramatically, not as a public admission of defeat, but deliberately and strategically. The grain mill, the trading post, the secondary operations all technically remained in partnership, but they were restructured into a network of separately incorporated entities with different ownership structures. On paper, it looked like the partnership had been dismantled. In practice, everything continued operating exactly as it had, but now with legal structures that even the most aggressive Colorado courts couldn't challenge. The lawsuit stalled. The lawyers filed motion after motion, arguing that the restructuring was a shell game, that it violated the spirit, if not the letter, of state law. But they couldn't prove it violated the actual law, and without a legal violation, they had no case. 2 years after the lawsuit was filed, the court dismissed it for lack of legal standing. The partnership, technically no longer a partnership, but functioning as one, had survived. But Thomas understood what had happened. Even if the legal documents didn't show it, they'd compromised. They'd made the structure uglier, more complicated, harder for future people to understand. They'd done it for survival, but survival at the cost of clarity is a particular kind of loss. He said as much when the lawyers declared victory and the partnership leadership gathered to acknowledge the outcome. Sarah listened, then asked the question that had been waiting in her mind since the lawsuit began. What would my father have done? Everyone was quiet, because they all knew the answer. Running Bear would have fought harder. He would have believed in the principle enough to risk everything on it. He might have lost, but he would have lost without compromise. He was younger, Rachel said finally, and he was fighting for survival, not maintenance. We're in a different position now. Maybe the compromise is acceptable. Or maybe, Rebecca said quietly, it's the first step toward becoming what we were fighting against. Small compromises, one at a time, until we wake up one day and realize we've become exactly the institutional power that we opposed. Catherine, now in her 40s and carrying the weight of the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation's expansion, spoke up. The real fight isn't here. It's not in Millbrook, and it's not in Denver courtrooms. The real fight is in the schools. It's in the young people who are growing up not knowing the boundaries we had to fight so hard to cross. If we lose our minds fighting legal battles, we lose sight of why we started this in the first place. But we compromised, Thomas said. We made the structure less pure. Yes, Catherine agreed. And my students don't care about purity. They care about working systems. They care about communities that function. They care about being able to cooperate across boundaries that their parents saw as absolute. The restructuring is ugly, but it works. And working is better than pure and defeated. In the aftermath of the lawsuit, Thomas found his place shifting again. He was no longer needed for the operational management, and now he wasn't needed for the legal battles either. He existed in a strange space, respected as a founder, but increasingly irrelevant to the actual work being done. He threw himself into writing with new intensity. He began documenting not just the partnership's history, but the tensions within it, the compromises, the difficult choices, the moments when principle met necessity and neither won cleanly. Margaret worried that he was obsessing, that the disappointment of the lawsuit was pushing him back into the old patterns of trying to control outcomes and solve problems that weren't actually his to solve anymore. "You can't fix this," she said one evening, finding him at his desk again, papers spread before him, his mind churning through legal arguments and historical precedents. "I can document it," Thomas said. "I can write it down in a way that makes it clear what we faced and what we chose." "So that future people can judge whether you chose correctly?" Margaret asked. "Is that what this is?" Thomas put down his pen. He looked at his hands, aged hands, marked by decades of work, by the physical labor of building things and the emotional labor of holding partnerships together. When had he become a man so desperate for vindication that he needed to write down every decision and defend it for posterity? "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I'm just trying to make sense of it." "You don't have to make sense of it," Margaret said. "You have to live with it. And I think you're struggling because you've never actually done that. You've been so busy building and defending and managing that you haven't actually sat with the fact that things are complicated and uncomfortable and messy." She was right. Thomas knew she was right. But knowing it and accepting it were different things. Accepting it required letting go of the last illusions of control he still carried. Catherine came to visit a month later, bringing news from the foundation schools. The network had expanded to 30 communities now, with plans to grow further. The model was working not perfectly, but sustainably. Young people were being educated in systems that valued cooperation over hierarchy, that taught the skills necessary to navigate across cultural boundaries. "There's something else," Catherine said. She hesitated, as if uncertain about sharing what came next. "I've been approached about taking the foundation national. There's interest in other states, in other territories. But it would require me to leave Colorado, to establish headquarters somewhere more central, to make this bigger than what we've built here." Thomas felt something sharp in his chest, the pain of watching the next generation move beyond what he'd created. "What do you want to do?" "I want to do it," Catherine said. "I want to build something that lasts beyond Colorado, beyond my lifetime. But I wanted to ask you first. You spent your life building this place, this community. Is it all right if I leave it to make something bigger?" Thomas thought about the question. He thought about Running Bear, who'd looked at a desperate man and seen potential. He thought about Sarah, who'd taken over her father's work and expanded it. He thought about Eleanor, who'd given her money to transform communities she'd never personally visited. "Yes," he said finally. "It's more than all right. It's necessary. You have to build bigger than what we built here. That's what the mission, next generation, always has to do." "Don't you worry it will change?" Catherine asked. "The model will evolve once it leaves Colorado. It will become something different." "I'm sure it will," Thomas said. "And I'm sure some of that change will feel like corruption. But that's what happens when ideas move into different contexts. They transform. And sometimes the transformation is better than the original vision." After Catherine left, Thomas sat with Margaret and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. The work that he'd started, that Running Bear had catalyzed, and Thomas had chosen to build, was now moving into the world in ways he couldn't control or shape. And that was exactly as it should be. He was 73 years old. He'd spent the last 30 years of his life building something, and now he needed to spend the remaining years, however many he had, learning to let it go. Not abandoning it. Not ceasing to care about it, but releasing the desperate grip that came from feeling responsible for its success. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, seeing something in his face shift. "No," Thomas said truthfully, but I think I'm learning to be, and I think that's all anyone can really do." The mountains held their silence around them, the way they always had. And in that silence, a man who'd spent a lifetime refusing to accept his assigned place in the world finally accepted something more difficult, that he wasn't the center of the story anymore. The story was much larger than him, and that was beautiful, even if it hurt to acknowledge. Thomas Whitmore died on a spring morning, quietly, in the home he shared with Margaret in Silverton. He was 76 years old. He'd been ill for only 2 weeks, a sharp, decisive illness that gave him time to say goodbye to the people who mattered, but not so much time that suffering became unbearable. Margaret was beside him when it happened. Catherine and David had come from their new headquarters in Kansas City. Sarah and Rebecca had arrived the day before. Even Reverend Hutchins, now ancient himself and long since retired from his pulpit in Millbrook, had made the journey to sit with Thomas in his final days. The funeral was held in Silverton, in the school building that Eleanor Whitmore's foundation had funded. Over 400 people came, settlers and Ute, and people from territories that Thomas had never personally visited, but whose communities had been touched by the partnership model, by the schools, by the idea that boundaries could be crossed. Margaret, speaking first, told the story of a man she'd met late in his life who was finally learning how to rest. She described his hands rough from work, gentle in companionship. She talked about how he'd stopped trying to save the world and started simply witnessing it, trusting that the seeds he'd planted would grow without his constant tending. Catherine spoke about legacy. She described standing in a classroom in Arkansas, where young people of different races were learning together and realizing that the foundation they were using had roots that went back to a desperate man standing at a ridge, refusing to accept the limited options he'd been offered. She talked about how her father had given her permission to build bigger, to transform the model into something suited for different contexts, to let it evolve beyond his understanding. Sarah, the last to speak, simply held up a worn journal, one of Running Bear's personal records, from the years when he was building the partnership. She opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon and read aloud, "I asked Thomas what he feared most. He said it was failing his daughters, being unable to provide for them, watching them suffer because of his inability. I told him that every man fears this. But few men are wise enough to understand that protection sometimes means stepping aside. Thomas is learning this. When he is done learning it, he will understand something most men never do, that the greatest gift we give our children is the freedom to become larger than we are." Sarah closed the journal. "My father was right. Thomas became something remarkable, not because he was strong, but because he learned to be weak in the right ways. He learned to surrender. He learned to trust others. He learned that his life only mattered in the context of the lives it touched. And I think those are lessons we all need to learn before we die." In the weeks after Thomas's death, the partnership continued operating exactly as it had. There was no crisis. There was no dramatic moment of rupture or reorganization. The governance structures held. The schools ran. The commerce continued. The bridge remained standing. This, perhaps more than any eulogy, was the greatest testament to what Thomas had built, that the work survived his absence entirely. He was not essential to the continuation. He had made himself successfully and completely obsolete. But his absence revealed something else as well. How much of the partnership's survival depended not on any single person, but on a culture that had been created. Young people who'd been educated in integrated schools saw cooperation as natural. Communities that had experienced successful trade across boundaries no longer feared those boundaries as absolute. An entire generation had grown up seeing the impossible become commonplace, and therefore assumed that other impossible things might also become possible. Margaret, staying in Silverton rather than returning to Colorado, found herself becoming something of a keeper of Thomas's memory. People came to her, young teachers, community organizers, people building similar models in other places, asking about how it had started, what Thomas had actually been like, what the original choice to partner with Running Bear had meant. She told them the truth, that Thomas hadn't been a visionary. He'd been a desperate man who'd made one good choice, and then spent the rest of his life trying to honor that choice through integrity rather than through repeated heroic gestures. He'd failed sometimes, he'd compromised sometimes. He'd struggled with temptation and doubt and the weight of responsibility. He'd been, in short, human. But he learned something that most people never do, Margaret told them. He learned that integrity isn't about being perfect, it's about being consistent. It's about making a choice and then spending your life honoring it, even when circumstances change, even when you're tired, even when easier paths present themselves. That's what he did. That's all he did. But it was enough. 3 years after Thomas's death, the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation held a conference bringing together educators, organizers, and community leaders from across the United States. The conference was called Building Bridges, Lessons from the Partnership Model, and it was attended by nearly 1,000 people. Catherine gave the keynote address. She stood on a stage in Chicago and told the story of her father, not Running Bear, but Thomas Whitmore, the man who'd chosen not to marry into her family, but to build something with them instead. She described the original moment when Thomas had refused the expected offer, and how that refusal had opened space for something unexpected. She talked about how the partnership had never been designed, it had been discovered, through the process of two people with different worlds, making the deliberate choice to build something that belonged to neither of them entirely. We often think about building bridges as a grand gesture, Catherine said. We imagine heroes making dramatic choices, facing down opposition with courage and moral clarity. But the real work of bridge building is much smaller. It's showing up to meetings, it's learning another person's language, it's compromising on things that feel important. It's continuing to believe in cooperation even when cooperation seems naive. It's refusing to let fear determine your choices. She paused, looking out at the crowd. My father, Thomas, wasn't a hero in the way we usually define heroes. He was a man who made one choice to refuse something and then spent the rest of his life trying to make that refusal matter. He failed as often as he succeeded, but his failures were honest failures, the kind that come from trying something that matters rather than playing it safe. Catherine's voice softened. If this model spreads, if it transforms communities and creates different possibilities for how people can live together, it won't be because Thomas Whitmore was a visionary. It will be because he taught us that the work is bigger than any single person. It will be because he learned to let go. By the time Margaret herself died, 15 years after Thomas, the foundation had established schools in 43 communities across the United States. The partnership model had been adapted for different economic contexts, different cultural situations, different geographic realities. Each adaptation changed the original vision, transformed it, sometimes in ways that Thomas might not have recognized, but the core remained. The understanding that communities function better when they're built on shared decision-making, when they honor multiple perspectives, when they see differences as resources rather than threats. Margaret left her journals to the foundation. In them, she'd recorded conversations with Thomas, his doubts, his struggles, his late-night meditations on whether his choices had actually mattered. They're now part of the historical archive, available to researchers and community organizers studying the origins of the partnership model. One passage from Margaret's final entry is particularly quoted. I asked Thomas this evening what he would tell his younger self, the desperate man standing at the ridge, about to refuse the offer that would have saved his family. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I would tell him that the choice he makes will be harder than he can imagine. I would tell him that there will be nights when he doubts it was right. I would tell him that the bridge he builds will be imperfect, and the communities he helps create will be flawed. But I would also tell him that the alternative, accepting the easy rescue, would have meant accepting a cage. And some cages are more comfortable than others, but they're still cages. The bridge is harder, but it's freedom. Today, over 100 years after Thomas first stood at that ridge and refused an offer that would have saved him through obligation, the partnership model exists in hundreds of communities across North America. It's not perfect. Some attempts at integration have failed. Some communities have struggled to maintain the delicate balance between cooperation and autonomy. Some organizations have become corrupted, using the language of partnership while maintaining hierarchies underneath. But the possibility remains. The idea that communities don't have to organize themselves around fear of the other. The understanding that cooperation across boundaries creates better outcomes than conflict over boundaries. The lived experience of young people growing up in integrated communities who see such integration as normal rather than revolutionary. All of this traces back to one man who was offered salvation and refused it, who chose instead to build something uncertain with people he didn't know, who spent his life making himself less important so that others could become more important, who learned, finally, that the greatest gift you can give is permission for others to exceed you. Thomas Whitmore never saw most of what his choice created. He never traveled to the communities where his partnership model had been adapted. He never met most of the thousands of people whose lives were transformed by institutions that grew from his refusal to accept an easy rescue. But that's all right. That's perhaps exactly as it should be. The work that matters is the work that continues after you're gone. The bridge that holds is the bridge that doesn't depend on the hands that first built it. The legacy that endures is the legacy that transforms so completely that the original vision becomes unrecognizable. Thomas Whitmore understood this. In his final years, sitting on porches overlooking mountains and valleys, watching young people walk through towns without fear of difference, he seemed content with his obsolescence. Content with the fact that his name would fade while the work continued. Content with having chosen once to refuse, and then spending a lifetime honoring that refusal. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. And somewhere in the spaces between communities, in the conversations that bridge differences, in the schools where young people from incompatible worlds learn that incompatibility is a story, not a fact, somewhere in all of that is Thomas Whitmore. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a man who learned that sometimes the greatest power is the willingness to step aside and let others build what he could only imagine. The choice to say no opened a door, and through that door walked generations of people who would build things he never knew he made possible. That is the real story. Not the desperate man at the fence, not the partnership model or the schools or the foundation. The real story is what happens when someone refuses to accept the role assigned to them and builds something different instead. The real story is that ordinary people, making honest choices, can create the conditions for transformation that lasts far beyond their own lives. The Apache Chief told the poor farmer, "I choose you for my daughters." The poor farmer answered, "I choose to build something we can share." And in that choice, both their worlds changed forever. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but changed. And in the changed world, impossible things became possible. That is a bridge worth building. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.